Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, depending where you're connecting from, and welcome to this open class, second to last of our 2023-2024 cycle. Today, we will touch one of the most popular study area in our offer, economics, with Professor Sarah Eichmeier. But I'll start with a quick icebreaker, a few questions, so we can better know our audience. So we will use Pollev. So let me first share the instructions. So as we said, hope you can see all my slides. Today open class will be about social media and society, and will be held by one of our professors. You can now collect to Poll Everywhere, okay, at the link you see here, pollev.com Università Bocconi 011, to answer the first question. In the meanwhile, I will share the screen so that everybody can see the answer. So I change the sharing of my screen, and here we are. I give you a few seconds so everybody can connect to Università Bocconi 11 in Pollev. Following the link you also see at the top of the page, and we see the first pin coming in. We have a lot connecting from Europe, but California, good morning. And then we have Argentina, we have a country in Central America. The map is too small, I cannot see, but we also have Africa, and then good evening to our friends in India and in China and in all the other Asian countries. So a very diverse and international audience today, as well as often with Bocconi events and Bocconi in general, I would say. So let's move to the next question. So there are still a lot of someone from Antarctica, I doubt it, but yes. So let's go to the next question. We want to know, what are you interested in studying? And of course, you can see our fields of study. Not surprising, economics plays a major role, also because it's the topic of today's class. So yes, but also management, it's very, very popular, and they're not far easily combined in our academic offer. Of course, finance is always present when you talk about Bocconi. Perfect. So yeah. And then third and last question, write the first word that comes to your mind when thinking about the expression social media. Okay. How many? Super fast. I would like to ask Professor Eichmeier to comment as far as it gets a little bit stable, because we're getting a huge amount of answers.
Yeah, I saw addiction pop up right in the beginning. That's going to be a little bit the topic of my talk today, so that will be interesting. Connection as well, communication. I see fake, that I guess it's about fake news, opportunity. So you see a good mix of the positives and the negatives.
Yeah. Okay, so we can stay here receiving question all day, but I think it's now time to start with the actual class. Question will be taken at the end. through the same tool. So Pollev will be activated for the Q&A session after Professor Heickmeyer class. So I leave the floor to the actual class, and then we will be in touch later. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me share my screen and go into the full screen mode. All right, I hope you can all see the slides now.
We can see the screen. It's not full screen yet.
Now?
Um,
let me see, I will resume it, and now I think it should work. There we go.
Yeah, now it's perfect.
Perfect, great. All right, then I will take it from here. Welcome everybody to this lecture on social media and society. I'm very excited to talk to you and for you to join in from all over the world and your interest in this topic and the potential to come to Bocconi. So I'm one of the teachers also in the first year sequence of the undergrad degree in economics. So I may see some of you down the line in my class. That would be really wonderful. So today's lecture is on the topic of social media and society. But before we start with that, I thought it would be actually interesting and maybe useful for you to hear a little bit more about my background, why I chose economics, and to get a bit of a broader overview of my research, because I think much of this reflects more general themes and research themes and opportunities in economics that may be quite different from sort of the standard view you may have from high school about what economics is about, because this has really changed a lot over the last 20 years. And after that, which I think should take about 10 minutes, maybe 15, I will talk about my research on social media and society. All right, so let's hit it off with some more background about myself. So I am an assistant professor of economics at Bocconi, and I've been here since 2022, so for about a year and a half. And my academic path or trajectory is really very typical for a university professor. So I first got my undergrad and master's degree in economics in Germany and Switzerland. So I was at the University of Heidelberg for my bachelor's degree and then in Zurich for my master's degree. And then I went to the US for my PhD. I went to California. I saw there was someone joining in. I remember the mess with the 9-hour time difference between Europe and California. I suffered from that for many years. So kudos to you for joining so early. So I got my PhD at Stanford. And I finished that in 2020. And then I worked at the University of Munich for 2 years before coming to Bocconi. And this is really very typical of how you end up in a job like mine as a university professor, which usually involves getting an undergrad and a master's degree, then getting a PhD degree, which takes about 6 years. Then one works as an assistant professor for typically 6 to 8 years. And then, if you're productive enough and you publish good research papers, then you become a full professor, which really the difference between assistant and full professor is that when you're a full professor, you cannot ever be fired anymore. That's called tenure. And the idea of that is, why do we have that system? Seems strange, is because we want to give people ultimate freedom to work on the topics, on the questions that they think are really deep and interesting and difficult to do. And if we didn't give this tenure, so if we made people's job security depend on their short-term publishing record, then that would really disincentivize people from taking on big and risky projects. And so for that reason, we give people, after they've been vetted, until the age of 40, and then once you reach that age, then we say, okay, now if you've published well enough, now we give you this tenure, and with that you can not be fired anymore, and you have more freedom with your research. So that's basically the trajectory for people who stay at the university like me. Now, let's talk a little bit more about why I think economics is interesting. So there's a part of that I think you already know. So there's some really well-known reasons for why economics is a really, really powerful subject or tool to learn to reason about the world. So the first is that it really teaches you very rigorous thinking about very key aspects of society and markets, including incentives, trade-offs, and all sorts of policy levers, like, for example, the minimum wage in labor markets and so on. And it also teaches you very useful and important quantitative skills, especially in applied math. A lot of economics deals with constraint optimization problems. We also teach a lot of statistics, which is super helpful in general in basically almost all jobs, and including data science jobs, for example. And we also do a lot of economic modeling. So you learn how to distill a complex problem into a more sort of abstract, simplified model, which really helps thinking through the trade-offs. Now, then there's another side to economics that is maybe less well known from your high school economics classes. And that's, I think, the thing that ultimately got me so excited to stay in econ and pursue this research career. And that is that economics is also an amazing, if not the best subject for people who are really interested in big social questions. Such as, for example, what are the causes of political polarization that we've observed over the last few decades? What makes some countries poor and others rich? Or how has social mobility developed in the last few decades? So how have the chances for poor kids to make it to high up in the income distribution, how has that developed over the last few decades, and what explains these developments? And the other sort of nice aspects of econ is that it's really great for people who like to work quantitatively and empirically. So who like to work with data and who you like to use the scientific method to work on big social questions. And you may ask, well, this doesn't sound like your ordinary econ class on supply and demand. So how is econ so predispositioned to be so good at answering or attempting to answer a bunch of these big questions, like, for example, why do some countries grow so much and others stay poor? That is in large part because of the data and causal inference revolution that really was spearheaded by economists among all the social scientists. So previously, up until a few decades ago, maybe up until just 20 years ago, the social sciences, and that includes economics, were primarily a theoretical field. But now, over the last few decades, since there's more and more data and computing power available, we've actually been able to test and improve on a lot of these very abstract theories using real data. And we have learned to use an approach much more similar to the natural sciences. And that is, in particular, we have made extensive use of what I call field experiments and natural experiments to find out why societies develop in the way they do, and to also make suggestions, give policy advice about education or health policy, for example, based on data. And this is exemplified. So the Nobel Prize in Economics always takes about a decade or two from the moment when people made the biggest innovation. So here's the 2021 Nobel Prize. Here you see the three winners of that Nobel Prize. The person on the bottom right, Guido Immens, was actually one of my teachers during the PhD at Stanford, and David Card was just around the corner at Berkeley. So these are three economists who won the Econ Nobel Prize for their work on natural experiments in labor economics, which is they developed important methods to try and answer questions such as, what is the impact of the minimum wage on the labor market? So does the minimum wage actually destroy jobs, or does it not? And how does it influence average wages in the economy? These are super key questions from a policy point of view. And they've developed methods to answer this in the absence of being able to randomize places into having a minimum wage or not having one. And that they did that by looking at states within the United States that border each other and have different minimum wage levels, and where these minimum wage levels changed over time. And so that gave them what's called a natural experiment to try and figure out what's the causal effect of the minimum wage on labor market outcomes. Now, there are also other recent Nobel Prize winners that also fall in this category of like this recent research strand on using natural experiments and field experiments to elucidate very, very important social questions. And these are the people listed on this slide, actually. The two people on the left, Abhijit and Esther, I had the privilege to work with them on a research project, actually. So I have a research article that I wrote together with them a few years ago. So they're really fantastic researchers. And these three people are all what we call development economists. So these are people who work on important questions related to low-income countries, and in particular trying to figure out what kinds of institutional and other kinds of barriers hinder people from sort of escaping extreme poverty. And they take what's called a field experimental approach. So they take an approach similar to what scientists would do in a lab experiment, but they take it out of the lab and find ways in more natural settings to try out different interventions and see which ones work in terms of improving people's living conditions by randomizing different, for example, communities into receiving different interventions. And then learning which ones work and scaling those up. So these are just some examples from the recent years of economists who are working using these really new methods on super interesting questions. So now talking a little bit about my research. So I work on topics in broadly two areas. So my first research area is working on the causes of figuring out the causes of social inequality and poverty. And the second topic area that I work on a lot is that of political economy, what's called political economy, and political opinion formation, in particular trying to figure out how political opinions are shaped by the environment. Now, talking a little bit about this first strand of research, so the causes of social inequality and poverty. For example, I have listed two studies of mine here, and you can delve into them in more detail when you go to my website. So you can just Google my name, and then you're going to, first thing that shows up, I think, is my website, and you find links to all of my research work. So totally, if you're interested, you can totally go there and read up more. So for example, in one project, I have looked at how unplanned parenthood influences the life trajectories of women who live in poverty. And in particular, I wanted to figure out to what extent this event is a stabilizing event, or to what extent it's really destabilizing. And then figuring out sort of in more detail in which domains of life is it stabilizing and in which one is it destabilizing. So I've looked at housing outcomes, like, for example, homeless shelter stays, and also economic and psychological indicators of well-being for women that I observe in administrative data before and after they have their first child. I've also worked a bunch on the opioid epidemic, I guess having spent so many years in the US, where this is a huge tragedy that's been going on for at least 15 years, with a lot of people falling into addiction from prescription opioids. So I've done a study that actually investigated to what extent receiving an opioid prescription in a medical context leads people to develop an addiction to opioids and to have adverse outcomes later on. And that study made use of a natural experiment, so where I used health records from a big health insurance company, and I compared people who went to the emergency department and got as good as randomly assigned to different doctors. Some doctors who really had a tendency to hand out opioid prescriptions a lot, and other doctors who almost never handed them out. So I could compare the trajectories of patients who got assigned to doctors that prescribe a lot to those who got assigned to doctors who prescribed this drug very little. And that allowed me to make conclusions about the causal impact of receiving a prescription on these downstream outcomes. So just to give you a sense of these kinds of empirical methods and how you can use them for these really answering these really big questions that fall into all sort of domains of social science and sometimes even medicine and epidemiology. Now, in my research on political economy and political opinion formation, I have done I think, now there's 3-4 studies I've completed over the last 4 years. One of them I will talk about today. That is the study about how social media influences individual well-being, knowledge about the news, and also political polarization. And that's going to be a field experiment. So that's what we will talk about today. And another study that I currently work on that is looking at trying to understand to what extent history education is actually successful in inoculating people against extreme political ideologies. So that's again a natural experiment that I'm looking at in my country, in Germany, where I'm comparing high school students who got as good as randomly assigned to either study the East German communist regime or the Nazi regime. And then I track them down 10, 15 years later, and I ask them about their opinions towards the far right and the far left on the political spectrum to try and figure out to what extent the people who studied one regime are more critical towards that ideology and the parties most closely linked to that ideology today. Okay, so with that, I think it's a good moment to dive into my study on social media. I saw that someone raised their hand. I think it's best to leave the questions to the end, mostly because we don't have that much time, and I think that's a more economical method. So save your question, post it in the Q&A, and then we'll get back to it in the end. So let's start with some statistics about social media so that they may be totally obvious to you or maybe not. I feel like some of these numbers are just wild. So there are more than 5 billion social media users around the world as of this year. So more than half of the global population is using social media regularly. And compared to the previous year, there was a growth of 260 million new users. So huge amount of people joining social media every year. And this typical social media user actually doesn't visit just one platform, but visits something like more than 6 different social media platforms each month and spends on average more than 2 hours per day using social media. So that means that people who use social media spend roughly 15% of their awake time on social media platforms. So that's just a huge amount of our lifetime. And the biggest platforms, the biggest 10 platforms in terms of usership I have listed here. So Facebook is by far the largest platform, has about 3 billion monthly active users. I think in your generation, in some countries, there are other platforms that have become larger, but still Facebook, also for the young population, for many countries around the world, is still the biggest player when it comes to social media. It's followed by YouTube and WhatsApp, and then there's Instagram and TikTok and WeChat and so on. And there's actually quite some stability. So some of these players have been around since the late 2000s, so 2007-8, like Facebook, YouTube, and WhatsApp. And then there's also a bunch of churn towards the bottom. So for example, TikTok, I think 5 years ago didn't even exist. Instagram is also, I think, just about 10 years old. So some of these platforms managed to grow their usership base super quickly, just over the course of a few years. So social media has really, seeing these statistics that we spend 15% of our awake time on average on social media really signifies or shows just how deeply it has woven itself into our lives. And naturally, given that we spend so much time on it, that means that we spend a lot of time less on other stuff. So it really induced big changes in how we spend our time, in whom we interact with, what we communicate about, how easy it is to coordinate for stuff, how we get information, how fast information becomes available, who disseminates it, and how easy it is to access it. So across a host of really key domains, we see huge changes that came about because of social media. Now, a fundamental question then for societies is to figure out what are the consequences of the rise in this technology for society. On the one hand, what are the consequences to individual well-being and mental health? And on the other hand, also what are the broader societal consequences when it comes to political outcomes and the stability of political systems. Now, this is really key to figure out because knowing what the consequences are can help us make better use of the positives and guard against the negatives of these technologies. So for policymakers, it's important to know this because then they can figure out what regulations would help in mitigating some of the positives while the negatives while keeping the positives. For citizens, it would be also good to figure this out because they need this information to make better informed decisions about their own use of these technologies and also their kids' use. And then for innovators, it's really useful to have this information to design better platforms. Now, economists, among all the social and other scientists out there, have really great research tools available to tackle these questions of what are the consequences of the rise of social media for society, because we're really extensively trained in empirical research. And I mentioned this earlier. So we're really, our bread and butter is trying to distinguish correlation from causation and measure causal relationships, which really are at the heart of many of the biggest questions our societies are facing today. So let's see these tools in action. So a quick caveat for all research, not just in the social sciences, it's always going to be, a given research study is always going to be local. It's always going to tell you something about one specific context, okay? So for example, today, I will talk about a study that looks at the impacts of Facebook, and that means, that is going to be relevant for this platform for the specific time period we're studying. And we need to make a bunch of assumptions to actually extrapolate from this to other time periods and other platforms. That's always important to keep in mind. There's always this trade-off in research in answering a question very cleanly and having the question be really broad and answer a very big question. So how can one go about trying to estimate the impact of social media? So there are several challenges in trying to do this with sort of the traditional methods. So first of all, the timing or the introduction of a given social media platform is not random. And so we cannot simply compare the outcomes that we, for example, have in a survey from before the platform was active to after, because there may have been other things that changed that have nothing to do with the platform that may explain the changes in the survey outcomes. It's also clearly not random who is using this platform. So we cannot simply compare users and non-users, okay? That doesn't give us a good sense of what's the causal impact of using the platform. And it's also really hard to study these questions in these very controlled behavioral laboratories, because there typically we can have people come and participate in small experiments, but those last typically 10 minutes. So it's not a really good natural setting to study the impacts of social media. So two methods in the empiricist's toolbox that are really helpful for answering this key question are randomized field experiments and natural experiments. And today we will look at a study that falls in that third category, that of randomized field experiments. So this study is called The Welfare Effects of Social Media. And that's a study that I did together with 3 colleagues of mine, Hunt Alcott, Luca Braghieri, and Matthew Gansko. Hunt and Matthew are both professors at Stanford, and Luca is a professor here at Bocconi. And this article was published in the American Economic Review, which is a big economics journal for academic research articles, in 2020, so 4 years ago. And this is a very big randomized field experiment we ran in order to figure out what are the causal impacts of Facebook on individual well-being and on political outcomes. So a little bit of a roadmap for talking through this paper. So I will give you a brief introduction, then talk about the experimental design and the results. So early on, when social media came about, there was a lot of hope that this technology is really going to bring a lot of positives to the world. So for example, it makes it much easier for people to connect from all across the world. Here you see the Facebook graph that shows you all the connections between different Facebook users around the world, really showcasing, how much easier this technology makes it for people to connect from across vast distances. Then later on, a few years later, the public discussion really shifted towards the costs. So there is a big worry nowadays about the individual harms of social media platforms use, so that these platforms may be addicting. And there are also big worries that there are societal harms in the form of political polarization, so that platforms like Facebook, for example, create echo chambers where people who are like-minded stick together, and then that amplifies political polarization. And similarly, that these platforms may have algorithms that may push content that is more polarizing, thereby polarizing people more. But we actually have very little research on what of this is actually true on the cost and the benefit side. And that's because of what I talked about before, that it's really difficult to find good research designs to answer this question well. So that's where we come up in with our study, where we ran a big randomized field experiments in which we paid users to deactivate their Facebook accounts for 4 weeks. And we did that ahead of the 2018 US midterm election. So we're going to focus on US users, and we're going to have a big group of users. We randomize some of them, pay them. So the treatment group will be paid to deactivate their Facebook account, and what we call the control group will keep using it as usual. And then we will compare the outcomes of these two groups. And we will look at two different sets of outcomes. The first is individual effects. We will look at how did getting off Facebook change the way people spend their time, and also what about their well-being, so what they report about their mental well-being, and how much they use Facebook after the intervention is over. And then we will also look at the societal effects. So we will look at these outcomes related to politics. So we ask people about their individual knowledge about the news, and also how extreme their opinions are towards current political topics. And so we will always compare the treatment and the control group, and that allows us to get at the causal impact of getting off Facebook for a month on all of these outcomes. So in terms of the experimental design, we needed to first find a bunch of people to participate in the study. And in order to find these people, we ran advertisements on Facebook, which seemed really convenient since we needed to recruit Facebook users. So a good place to try and recruit was on Facebook, actually. And so we could use the advertising function on Facebook, and we ran advertisements saying, participate in this study and earn, I think it was $30 or $50, something like that. So we didn't mention in the ads that we were going to ask people to get off Facebook, because we wanted to really recruit a representative sample. And when people clicked on the ad, it would lead them to an online survey where we would collect their baseline characteristics, so their age, their gender, how much they use Facebook, and stuff like that. And then later on, we randomly assigned each participant in our survey to one of two groups. The treatment group, where people were offered $100 in exchange for deactivating their Facebook account for 1 month. And a control group where people used Facebook as usual. And before we did this random assignment, we actually asked people to give us their Facebook handles, okay? So they couldn't create a handle after the fact and then give us that for deactivating. And then after this 4 weeks, in which one group kept their Facebook account, the other group deactivated, after 1 month, then we did another survey where we asked people to report their political opinions, participate in a knowledge quiz about the news, report on their well-being, and so on. And so these outcomes at the end, afterwards, those are the ones that we will use in order to figure out what's the causal effect of getting off Facebook. So how did we do this deactivation procedure? So it's actually really handy within Facebook, within the platform. When you log in, there's a function where you can deactivate your account temporarily. When you click this deactivation button, then you cannot access Facebook, but you keep the Messenger. So people could keep using Messenger. And whenever they logged back in, then they would automatically reactivate their account. and their profile would just look exactly like before, okay? So we asked people to go through this deactivation procedure, and then we could verify whether they were in fact deactivated by comparing, by navigating to their profile ID and checking what we saw. So this is how an active profile looks like. Here you see the active profile from Mark Zuckerberg from, I think this would be 3-4 years ago. So when you navigate to his profile page, this is what you would find. Now, when you navigate to someone's profile page who has a deactivated account, that's how it looks like. So we in an automated fashion, pinged people's profiles, and so we could figure out, are they indeed deactivated or not, okay? And it turns out that most people really complied with our deactivation protocol really well. I will show that to you in a second. I think I can probably skip this just to highlight. So we recruited 1,600 people for this study. And people were eligible as long as they had an active Facebook account, used Facebook at least 15 minutes a day, because otherwise we thought it's uninteresting to look at what's the causal impact of getting off it. And they also stated that they were willing to deactivate their account for $100. And only after that, they would find out if they were in the treatment or in the control group. So here you see the compliance levels. So on the x-axis here are the days after the beginning of the deactivation period for the treatment group. And on the y-axis are the share of a given group that we found, whose account we found deactivated, okay? So you can see the red series, those are the treatment, that's the treatment group. So clearly in the period where they weren't asked to deactivate, 0% of them were deactivated. And then starting at 0, they were asked to be deactivated, and you can see more than 90% of the group was deactivated throughout. So a little less than 10% of people didn't follow our protocol, but more than 90% of people did. And instead, in the control group, we pinged them occasionally, and you can see that basically nobody there was deactivated because we didn't ask them to. Now, in order to figure out what's the causal impact of getting off Facebook on outcomes, we can simply, since we randomize people, we can simply look at the average outcomes of those in the treatment group and the average outcomes of those in the control group. And by taking the difference between the two of them, we get the causal impact of getting off Facebook, okay? So that's the basic strategy when you do a randomized experiment that is so easy and so powerful in getting a causal impact estimate. So let's look at the effects. First, looking at the individual effects. I will show you the results basically always in this plot form, where on the horizontal axis, you see the treatment effect size, which is standardized so that we can compare the effect sizes across different outcomes. And the treatment effects are always going to be in standard deviation units, where just as a to fix ideas, this is something that you would cover in your statistics classes extensively. One standard deviation unit would be a huge effect size, would mean that the mean in the treatment group is dramatically different from that in the control group at the end of the intervention, okay? And a 0.5 effect size would still be massive. 0.1 is relatively small, okay? So here you can see the effect sizes for these different outcomes that are listed in the rows. The first one on the very top is Facebook minutes, tells you how many fewer minutes people spend on Facebook when they were assigned to the treatment group compared to the control group, okay? So this is minus 1.5 standard deviation units, which is a huge, huge, huge effect. In terms of the actual minutes, it's 60 minutes less. So people basically, the people in the control group use Facebook for around an hour a day. And the people whom we assign into the deactivation group use it exactly 1 hour less on average, meaning they went from an hour a day to 0. Okay, so 1 hour less time spent on this platform. And we also see that people actually spent more time when they were assigned to deactivation. They would spend more time on offline activities. So it's watching TV by themselves, spending time with friends and family offline, okay? And instead, they spend less time on other social media platforms. and other online activities. So people switch more towards offline activities. Next, looking at well-being. So we asked people a host of questions on how they were feeling. So for example, how happy they were feeling in the moment, about their life satisfaction, how lonely they are, and so on. And we see basically across the board for all these outcomes that people in the treatment group were doing a little bit better than those in the control group. Okay, and we can summarize all these different outcomes into one index. We found about 10% of a standard deviation unit increase in well-being, which is relatively small. Okay, so we don't find a ginormous positive impact on well-being. We find a small but pretty significant one. Now, when we look at the impact on the political outcomes, so I have to skip over a few other outcomes in the interest of time, but you can also find the paper on my website. So there you can look at everything, you know, there's an appendix with a lot more results. So if you're interested, that's a good place to check. So first, let's look at how people's knowledge about the news develops. So we actually have a news knowledge quiz where we ask people, I think it was something like 10 questions about current news events, multiple choice questions. And we found that the people who were in the treatment group performed worse on this news knowledge quiz. They answered on average, I think, 1 fewer question out of 10 correct than people in the control group. What does that mean? It means that when you get off Facebook, you're less informed about what's going on in the news. So that makes sense. That tells us that Facebook is actually one important channel where people get information about politics. Okay, so we find that getting off Facebook made people less informed about the news. Now, looking at polarization, so we also then ask people about their opinions on a lot of current news events, and we track how extreme their opinions are. And all these outcomes listed here are outcomes that measure how extreme people's opinions are. And the more negative the treatment effect, that means the more getting off Facebook makes people less extreme, okay? So we find overall, when we look at this index that summarizes all these different outcomes, that getting off Facebook reduced people's extremeness in their political opinions, moved them further to the center, okay? So we find these two interesting countervailing or effects where on the one hand, getting off Facebook makes you less informed, but on the other hand, it also makes you less extreme in your political opinions. We can also see that when we look at the distribution of outcomes for issue opinions, that we can basically align on a left to right scale, where the further left the opinion, the more it's skewed towards the left of the political spectrum, and the further right, the higher the number here on the horizontal axis, the more right-wing the opinion is. And we can plot the distributions of opinions across many topics for our control and our treatment groups. And we can see that the treatment groups, compared to their control counterparts, the distributions move further towards the center. So the two solid curves compared to the two dashed line curves, the two solid curves are further towards the center, meaning that people who are in the treatment group from both sides of the political spectrum ended up being less extreme in their political opinions than their counterparts who kept Facebook. So one thing that I haven't had time to talk about, but we also actually tracked what people's valuations of Facebook access are. So how much money, for example, we would need to pay them for them to keep deactivating their account for another month. And also initially we asked, well, how much money would you need to be paid in order to be willing to deactivate for just 1 month? And we actually found that people value Facebook a lot. So for example, 40% of the people that we recruited for our study were not willing to deactivate their account in exchange for $100. They said, no, I need to be paid more than $100 in order to be willing to participate in this study. So all these people weren't part of the study because we couldn't afford them. okay? Because we could only pay $100 for deactivating. But that shows you, how valuable Facebook is to a lot of people. At the same time, our results also suggest that potentially some people may overvalue Facebook, in the sense that we saw that getting off Facebook actually made them happier. And also 80% of the people who participated in our study and went through deactivation said that that was actually good for them, okay? At the same time, when we look at the societal or the effects on news and polarization, we also find pretty nuanced results, where Facebook, on the one hand, makes people more informed, but on the other hand, it also makes them more polarized. And I think these results reflect more broadly findings that sort of square across a host of domains. When you look at technologies that have such a big impact on people's time use and so on, it's unlikely that you will find that they are just bad for people or just good for people, but there will be nuance. There will be some domains where they're good and other domains where they're not so good. Or there may be some people for whom the goods outweighs the bads, and for others where it's the other way around. And I think with that, I will wrap it up for today. And now I am very excited to get all your questions.
Thank you, Professor Eichmeier. Super interesting topic and class. I was a little bit scared at the beginning when you start talking about switching off Facebook, since it's a very sensitive idea for our audience, but I see no one disconnected, so we ended it very well. Jokes aside, very interesting for many point of view. I really enjoyed the introduction about the academic career, because this is one of the common paths the students can take, and above all, the one studying in economics, in our experience at Bocconi. Yeah, that was something that we really appreciate. We have already opened the and also the definition of economics. That was very insightful, and I think it's super useful for students that are in the process of choosing their study. We already got a few questions during the class through the Q&A tool that I asked students to repost on the Pollab. The Pollab is already open, and I'm sharing right now the page. Let's go to the first one. Well, I will skip for a second the first one, and I'll go to the second one. Very interesting topics, also that the audience share my idea. Do you think people are aware of the negative side of being always connected?
I think overall, yes. So overall, people have a pretty good sense what's good for them and what's bad for them. So I think people are pretty good at introspecting on this and realizing, oh, wait, I spent an extra hour on this platform, on Instagram, on TikTok, when I wanted to actually do something else. And now I, feel really bad. So I think people have some awareness of it, but it's really, I think one key impediment on acting on that is really that it's so tempting to keep staying on these platforms, where these platforms have all the incentives to keep you there, right? Because their economic models are based on advertising revenue. And so the more time you spend on the platform, the more money the platform makes. And so I think that's really the tricky part, that they really play up the temptation aspect so much and really tap into our psychology. And so even though people may be quite aware from introspecting of the downsides, I think one key part that we're also working on figuring out is what kind of tools help people deal with the self-control issue more, or in a better way.
Thank you. As I was expecting, these type of classes triggers a question about the Bocconi admission, and etc. So one that was up at the very beginning was, is this a usual subject in international economics and finance? That we can translate it. How far is this open class from what students actually do in their studies here, Bocconi, in their bachelor?
Yes. So for economics, that's we have elective courses on social media. We also have mandatory courses on political economy and the role of institutions. So a lot of this stuff is core in our economics curriculum. So it's not in the first year, and the first year statistics is the first year focus is really on teaching methods. So you will see, for example, the Nobel Prize winners that I mentioned and their contributions to what we call econometrics. So that's that kind of work you will see in your first year. And then these more applied topics, like, for example, the role of social media, the role of institutions, development economics, what makes some countries grow and others less. That's stuff that you see in your second and third year in economics. So this is not stuff you would typically see in the finance program, for example. So though you may be able to take these courses as electives, but it's really much more core economics.
Okay. A more personal question. How has your research on social media use impacted your personal use of social media? Do you use it at all now after these researches?
Yeah, I do get this question a lot, and I have to say, so I think there are different types of people. So there are people who have a lot of self-control, and so they can take advantage of the good sides of social media and don't fall prey to some of the negatives so much. I am one of the people who doesn't have that kind of self-control. So already in the lead up to the study, I used all sorts of tools, in my browser that blocked my access to these platforms during the workday and so on. But since then, I've gone completely off. So I don't have the accounts anymore, apart from the ones that I need for my research on those platforms. But yeah, no, I don't use them. But I think there's an individual factor there that, it's too distracting for me.
Thank you. What method do you follow in order to assign numerical value to questions with highly varying results, such as political opinion? A very technical question.
Yes. So I think that's a really big deal in studies like these. And I didn't have much time to talk about the results in detail, which is why I threw these standard deviation unit effect sizes at you. And this is without sort of delving much into the details of that. And this is the key way that we try and make results comparable across studies and within studies across many different questions. So where we standardize the outcomes so that they are all on a similar scale. The downside of that is that the scale becomes less easily interpretable. So for example, looking at spending time with friends and family, I couldn't tell you how many more minutes or hours someone spent with friends or family, because the way I standardized the outcome was in this standard deviation units outcome or measure. So there's a trade-off here between interpretability of the scale and comparability of the outcome or the scale across outcomes.
Seems that students are very interested in research on the Q&A tool of Zoom. We also already receive a request if students can contact you to do research with you, so application already in place. Let's go to the next question. Does people not wanting to renounce to Facebook really mean that they're not willing to do because it adds value to them? Couldn't it be depends rather than value?
Yes, so we delve into that. That was one of the key questions we also wanted to figure out. Well, if Facebook ends up making people less happy, why do they keep access to it? Do they keep using it? So one hypothesis is there are trade-offs, maybe my well-being is negatively affected, but maybe on the other hand, now I am much better connected with people. I find out about events. I keep in touch with my relatives far away, right? It could be that there are these trade-offs and people resolve them and say, look, even though it makes me less happy, there's some positive side that I value more. than my little bump down in happiness. So that's one hypothesis. Another one is the one that the question asker brought up. Yeah, there could be dependence. So I may just keep using it because I've developed this habit, this dependence on it. And we find quite some evidence about that because, or in favor of this hypothesis, because at the end of the 4 weeks, we actually asked people, both the people who went cold turkey for a month and the people who were in our control group, how much they want to keep using Facebook for the next month. And it turns out the people who had gone cold turkey, they actually said, well, I'm going to use it a lot less now, which means, look, they broke this habit. And now that they broke this habit, now it's much easier for them to take a step back and use it less. So that does suggest that there is this dependence component, at least to some extent. But nevertheless, even in this group that went off Facebook for a month, the valuation to get Facebook back is still incredibly high for a lot of people. Okay, so it's not just dependence, it's also that this platform does provide a lot of value to people, even though it may, on average, have negative effects on some of these indicators of well-being.
Here, recommendation. Do you have any recommended reading to learn about this topic or economics in general? This question may take an hour to answer, but if you have a few hints, we can also make available to students.
Yeah, definitely. So I think one place to start, I mentioned also on the slides, is looking at, they have great overviews of recent research and of sort of the research frontier is looking at the economics Nobel Prize. So the website, they list all the Nobel Prize winners of the last few years, including really nice 2-3 page summaries of the work that they've been doing. And I think that gives a pretty good flavor of the variety of economics today at the research frontier, and sort of the kind of economics that you would encounter in your second and third year in the econ degree. So that could be one place to look.
Great. Here we're still on the university path choice, but the question is, what would you recommend to choose if my goal is to be an entrepreneur? More economics or more management?
I would say the combination. So we have a degree in economics and management, for example. I think that would be a really good choice. The nice thing is also that after a year, you have another point where you can decide, do you want to go more heavy on econ or more heavy on management?
Thank you. Thank you. Another question about study, but I mean, no better person to answer, being a professor in our university. Is economics heavy on maths?
Yes, it is. So not just, so I talked about the constraint optimization. So a lot of economic theory is about figuring out, for example, the profit maximization problem for the firm, or for the consumer, the utility maximization problem. And that requires quite a bit of algebra. There's also statistics, which is, for empirical researchers like me, is super key. So that's also obviously quite math heavy. Yes, so I would say yes. And it comes in very handy, both if you go into industry, so you don't take my route into academia, or when you go into academia. When you go into industry, it's really helpful because of this rigorous, logical way of thinking that is infused with math, which is extremely helpful. The data science part, which is super helpful when you go into industry. And when you go into academia, then I feel like, then I guess it's most of the study, a lot of the study gets you up to speed with the research frontier. It makes sense that this would be really handy for that career path too.
Perfect. Here, a very, let's say, important role to your research. To what extent could this study, and maybe other study in the same field, help us reduce political polarization? Could mass media as a whole cause political polarization?
Yeah, so this is the $1 million question that societies and social scientists are asking themselves. So how do we get an overall sense of how much different technologies, like for example, social media or online media platforms, how much they contribute to the rise in political polarization. And the evidence overall points towards an important role of the advent of the internet in having increased polarization, and within the advent of the internet, technologies like social media. So we cannot refute. We have a pretty high confidence that social media do play an important role in the rise in political polarization, but they are clearly not the only factor, and they may be a factor that together with other factors has really increased polarization. So not in isolation, but together with other factors.
Perfect. Talking about polarization, I've never seen such a fight between upvoting and downvoting of questions. So students are very active and keen to receive their answer. Let's go to the next one. In what ways does the perceived influence of social media undermine individual well-being, fostering a culture of comparison, anxiety, and disconnection?
Yes. So our study focused on older adults, where even there, when we looked at well-being, the biggest sort of the outcome that had the biggest effects was anxiety. So it is and this has replicated. There are 2 or 3 other experiments that were done in the spirit of our study in the years that followed, and the one outcome that they always also found moved the most among other well-being outcomes is anxiety. So there we have pretty clear evidence that using at least Facebook, and this probably translates to Instagram, if not even more strongly, does increase these issues around anxiety. Then, especially for younger populations, so teenagers, we don't have rigorous studies yet, and that's the population where we're the most worried, because there we have seen just mental health take such a turn for the worse since the advent of the smartphone. So, for example, I'm working on a new study where we're trying to figure out how these time use limits and parental control apps, to what extent they may help curb some of the downsides and some of the downside of these technologies for the mental health of adolescents and children. So that's definitely absolutely a top priority among policymakers, educators, and parents to figure out how much of this is harmful, and then also to potentially think about age limits, age restrictions for these platforms like Instagram.
Thank you. Thank you. I would like to remind you students that they need to post the question on Poll Everywhere. So you have the link at the top of the page. We are not able to take question posted on the Q&A tool of Zoom. Okay, so please repost your question in Poll. Next one. Since most of the people declined to activate account for $100, what was the most common price people asked for? I don't know if that was asked to the pool, but
Yeah.
There's a general idea of the cost of deactivating social media.
Yeah, so actually most people were willing to deactivate for $100. 40% were unwilling. So 40% needed more than $100. And we actually, in our experiment, we were, I guess, clever. So we ran a pilot, and we saw that so many people had a valuation of exactly $100. And so what we offered was $102, because that we knew that would get us a large proportion of the population at the lowest possible price, and we could not capture this 40% of people who needed more than this money, because it would have been too expensive. So we captured 60% of Facebook users who had this valuation of $100 or less. Yeah, so the modal answer was $100. That was by far the most common answer. So really high.
Yeah. Is the data really accurate, since participants could have alternative Facebook account or use alternative social media platforms?
We were really worried about that going into the study. This was a really, really risky study to run. It was very, very expensive. And there was a high chance that we wouldn't find any effect just because people wouldn't comply with our experimental protocol. Maybe because they would make a new account, or because they would simply change their minds and reactivate their account. So we were really, really worried about that. And we couldn't really do anything about people opening another account. Like, we couldn't observe that. We asked people at the end of the study, and it didn't impact what they were paid. Did you use Facebook anyways? So that was one way we were trying to get at this. And there was basically no one who said they did, but that makes sense, right? They may not want to tell us. And the other thing I can say is that if people had just gone out and created new accounts, then we wouldn't have found any effects. So our guess from the results are that the vast majority of people actually complied. And we really tried to convey that this was really important for the scientific validity of the study. So to appeal to people's sort of civic duty in not undermining the study by not complying with what we asked them to do. But 100%, they could have totally gone out and got another Facebook account. Maybe one thing that made people hesitant to do that also is that it's actually quite costly. A lot of the good experience of having a Facebook account comes from the friends network you have there, right? And so starting a new account, having to befriend all the people that you had in your original network is quite costly. And since we just asked for 1 month off, I think that's another reason. It was like a relatively small ask, and that helped as well.
Yes. Here we have a question, I mean, that we can rephrase, since students often have doubts between the economics and political science part. So apart from knowing if you teach also in our international politics and government program, maybe we can just try to see which are the difference in dealing with this topic between the economics point of view and maybe the political science one, even if I have to say that in Bocconi, they very often go together.
Yes. Yes. So in terms of the methods, economics and political science, I should say, maybe that's my biased view, has caught up to economics more and more over the last 10, 20 years, in the sense that they now have also a heavy empirical focus. So they are also by now getting up to speed when it comes to natural and field experiments, like the ones that we ran in our study, for example. So you will see that some of the empirical methods classes may overlap. Though I would say that because economists have been on this train for about a decade longer, we just have more extensive training in empirical methods and also more rigorous one. That's just because we're a decade or so. We started a decade or two earlier on this kind of focus on causal inference, which has a variety of reasons that have to do with how the different disciplines are organized. So I would say when it comes to empirical methods classes, can be some overlap, but I would say they would be more extensive. There would be more focus on that in economics. And then the intro classes would be completely different. So you wouldn't see what I mentioned about, political science is a lot less quantitative. So the models won't be based on mathematical models, but rather logical reasoning. So there you will see big differences. And so I would say, when you're interested in these broad social science questions and you have an empirical mindset, I would recommend to go with econ, because you get more of that empirical training.
Thank you. I think we can take one last question. I know there are much more, so let's try to find the one related to the class and not Bocconi in general that we will then address in the closing. Is there any difference in the use of social media between lower and higher social classes? If yes, in which way?
So we looked at that in our study because we asked people what is the highest degree they got, so education, and also what's their household income. And we tried to figure out whether we would see different effects of the activation by these background factors. And if I recall, we did not find systematic differences in how getting off Facebook impacted people. But I don't recall the baseline differences in use. So I don't recall whether people across different socioeconomic groups spend significantly different time on social media. My hunch would be that it's actually quite similar, so that you wouldn't see much difference. But where you see a huge difference, I think, is when it comes to parenting. So oftentimes, at least from survey evidence, it looks like high SES parents are much more how should I say that? Take much more care with their kids' technology use, so they are much more strict in that sense. And so that's one thing when it comes to parenting, where there are potentially big class differences. Some of that has to do with time constraints, that people who have, different types of work hours, who are single parenting and so on, just don't have the time to be so diligent in their kids' social media or digital technology use. But I think that's one way you see a big class divide.
Thank you. There are much more questions that unfortunately we don't have the time to take, but I mean, students hopefully will be part of our community and will be able to dig and research about this topic even further in the future. For all the questions related to being at Bocconi, let me share the slide back and to present the next opportunity to know more about our institution. There will be another open class in May, the last one of this cycle, and will be about the artificial intelligence. You can register in the same way and you will have a similar experience on a different topic. Then, if you want to know more about our institution, on May the 18th, there will be the open day, the biggest opportunity to know the university, both on campus or online in a virtual way. If you cannot come in this day, you will be able to visit our campus almost every Friday. We organize campus visit, campus tour almost every Friday. And last but not least, the most comprehensive opportunity to know better our institution, the summer school. We run a small program from the 2nd to the 5th of July in law in Italian, and the big program from the 8th to the 19th of July in English, covering all the different subjects. So all these will be occasion to know more about the university and to find answer to your question about the different programs and the possible careers you may have. You can also follow us on social media. We have a dedicated Instagram account talking about social platform for prospective students. So you will be able to get content dedicated to you that will help you for your choice to your study and, of course, your choice to join Bocconi here in Milan. And then the corporate account on all the other platform if you want to follow what Bocconi does in general. I think I'm done. I thank you for your time, for your participation. Above all, I thank you, Professor Ekmeyer, for the illuminating class, and my colleague Camilla for taking some of the question of the most related to the university in the chat. So thank you everybody for your time, and we really hope to see you here in Milan.